Hello and welcome to Watershed Wednesdays featuring Zoe Davis from the City of Boston. My name is Ian Cook. I'm the Executive Director of the Neponset River Watershed Association. And we are a grassroots nonprofit conservation organization working to clean up and protect the Neponset River. And increasingly, that goal of cleaning up and protecting the river is becoming more and more about managing the impacts of climate change. And they're going to be rather substantial all across the watershed in terms of extreme rainfall issues, increased heat, increased drought. And in some areas of the watershed, one of the biggest and in some ways best understood impacts is going to be sea level rise. And the city of Boston has been quite proactive in starting to understand these issues. And we're very lucky to have here with us today Zoe Davis, who is Climate Resilience Program Coordinator for the city of Boston, who is going to talk a little bit about Climate Ready Dorchester, which is the city's new effort to understand and begin planning for the future of the coastline along the Neponset River estuary and beyond. So without further ado, I will pass it off to you, Zoe.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Ian. I'm going to go ahead and take a couple seconds just to share my screen with you all. Okay, how are we doing? All right, awesome. Okay, let's begin. So first, I'll just start off by saying thank you so much, Nancy and Ian, for inviting me to come and speak with you all today. I'll spend the next few minutes briefing you on Climate Ready Boston, specifically coastal resilient solutions for Dorchester, and also alongside that share some of the other work that the city will be doing moving forward into the next year. So as Ian said, my name is Zoe Davis. I'm a climate resilience program coordinator with the City of Boston, and we're housed in the Environment Department. Climate Ready is housed within the Environment Department. And I work specifically on climate resilience, and we look at coastal resilience as well as stormwater and extreme temperatures, but focusing on heat. So I'll walk through some of the highlights of the coastal resilience report for Dorchester specifically. And then, as I mentioned, I'll go into some of the heat work, to be specific, that the city will be doing. And then we'll definitely have some time for Q&A. But before I dig into that, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to all of you who participated in the process to bring coastal solutions for Dorchester to fruition. So these reports are just milestones in this broader work, but the work definitely continues. And so myself and my team are looking forward to engaging with you all further. So as you know, as some of you may know, after the 2016 publication of the city's Climate Ready Dorchester report, we've been pretty busy undertaking some more detailed district level analysis to help develop the city's, essentially the to-do list when it comes to climate adaptation and specifically coastal resilience. So last year we completed a vision for Moakley Park to close off the flood pathway in that area, while also taking the opportunity to improve open space amenities and waterfront access. And we've also recently, alongside the Dorchester report, completed solutions for the North End and downtown area. And currently what we're doing now is looking at solutions for East Boston and Charlestown in the areas that were not covered in the previous process. And so when the coastal resilience plans are all together implemented, what we'll have achieved is the mayor's broader vision for a resilient Boston Harbor, which will allow us to achieve a continuous system for protection for the full 47 miles of Boston shoreline. And when these interventions are implemented, these plans will increase access and open space along the water's edge, while also protecting the city from sea level rise and coastal flooding from future storms. So while we're here today to talk a bit about and focus on Dorchester and specifically areas along the Neponset River, it's really important that we remember that the city is focused on these actions for natural resource areas, for buildings and neighborhoods and districts as a whole within the context of achieving this wider strategy to ensure that Boston can thrive within the context of a changing climate. And so the actions that we'll take in Dorchester are certainly a part of what will drive us to achieving that, that citywide vision. So I know we want to jump into the interventions, but before we begin, I just want to cover a few main points to keep in mind. First is that the pathway to implementation is a bit complicated. You know, given the majority of Dorchester's coastline is not owned by the city, but by the state, as well as private owners, there's a level of complexity considering the ownership and uses along the waterfront. And so it's clear that there is a role for private interests and owners to play in being a part of the solution, as well as coordination with the state. And so as the report will show you, successfully implementing the resilience investments along the Dorchester coastline is going to require a new level of coordination, including more robust coordination with our community groups and organizations, as well as our colleagues in academia, especially if we're to identify some sustainable solutions for the wetland area and end up with a world-class waterfront and a waterfront that is resilient. So it's possible to achieve, but there's a bit of complexity there. The next thing to keep in mind is that the solutions we develop are for all of us, and developing these solutions and implementing these solutions in an equitable way is key. We want to make sure that what is developed for the Dorchester coastline supports the interests of you all, the community, and just generally folks who live and work and play in the Dorchester area. So a key takeaway for the solutions for Dorchester is that all of these solutions are intended to increase access for even for residents who are inland and may feel a bit cut off from the waterfront. And so what this means is in building our process and in implementing these solutions, doing this, as I mentioned before, through equitable engagement, planning, and implementation. What's really cool about the Dorchester area is that there's exciting opportunities for integrating open space into these resilience investments, and that the natural restoration and the adaptation measures, especially along the Neponset River area, these can really reduce the flooding and the impact that that coastal storms will have on neighborhoods, both in the near term as well as in the long term. And the final thing that I will say here is that this is going to take all of us. You know, while we continue to identify some of the priority projects and to secure funding for some pilot projects, you know, it's going to take a new level of collaboration where all of us are involved. So everyone who values an accessible waterfront and a thriving city and safe community has a stake in ensuring that the plans are implementable and that they're implemented. So for all of you here and for all of you listening, your continued leadership in this process is really critical. And with that said, let's go ahead and dig into the report in a bit more detail. So first, the extent of the flooding. As a part of the report, we identified the coastal flood pathways within the area. What you see here encircled and some of the dark blue infringing on the white here is the current sea level rise. And what you're looking at here is, and all of the flood maps that I'll show you, all of the flooding that we'll see here is at the 1% chance, where our odds for experiencing a flood event are about 1 in 100 for each year. So what we're seeing here, and you can see in some of the photos, is flooding today, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this, flooding at Bayside, the Bayside development, and also along Morrissey Boulevard. Alrighty. And again, what we're seeing here is the blue infringing on the white here, also the 1% chance flooding, but this is at 9 inches expected, and we're expecting to see this in the year 2030. And what you'll notice here is an additional flood pathway along the northern side of Morrissey Boulevard, around Clam Point, also at Port Norfolk and the Neponset Circle area. And you can see that the flood pathway, especially on the north side of Morrissey Boulevard, will begin to merge with the flood pathway at Bayside. And finally, what we see here is the flood map showing the 40 inches of sea level rise at around the year 2070. And so we'll see a flood pathway at Harbor Point that will, or I should say, although we saw some fringe flooding at Harbor Point in 2030, we'll actually start to see that flood pathway in 2070 grow larger. And then at the southern end of Morrissey Boulevard, we'll see an additional bit of flooding, as well as at Pine Neck Creek and in the Lower Mills and Neponset wetlands. So what does all of this mean, and how is it integrated into the planning? From these flood pathways, the project team defined 5 main resilient solution zones to build out the resilience interventions. So these zones are what you see here at the Neponset Riverfront, Neponset Circle, and Adams Village, Clam Point, Antonian Beach, and then Columbia Point and Morrissey Boulevard. So what I'll do is I'll briefly walk through these proposed interventions that will close off the main pathways and show you some of those solutions. I do want to note, however, before I proceed, that ultimately from the process we aim to identify some clear next steps from this that will essentially catalyze the resilience process along the coastline. So, what we call these projects catalytic projects, but essentially it just means what we need to do first in order to close off the most intense and severe pathways. But it's really important to note that these are very much so high-level solutions. So, we're still in the process of charting the course towards a resilient waterfront, and we'll continue to refine these next steps with you all and other stakeholders as well. Alrighty, so at the Columbia Point and Morrissey Boulevard area, to close off the pathways around Bayside and Savin Hill, the solutions proposed here are to integrate the flood protection with the development at Bayside, as well as to raise the harbor walk around Harbor Point. And then at the northern side of Morrissey, there are actually 2 options for flood protection here. And the first is to fully raise the road, raise Morrissey Boulevard completely to the design elevation, or the elevation that will be needed to be higher than the projected flood heights. And then the second option is to build a landscape berm, or essentially an earthen mound, along the edge of Morrissey Boulevard for flood protection. So what the landscape berm allows is the option to include open space amenities and more public access along the waterfront. And here at Clam Point and Tinian Beach, we're looking at, for the southern side of Morrissey Boulevard, 2 landscape berms to close off that pathway and then tying back into the Southeast Expressway. For the Victory Park and Tinian Beach areas, the building in a waterfront boardwalk, as well as enhancing the wetland space and extending the beach here is a critical element of this solution. And what this really prioritizes is, again, increasing public access and access to open space amenities. In the near term, however, what is suggested here is to install a deployable where the Conley Street underpass is. But that is, essentially to address the immediate concern there. And then in the long term, flood protection will be needed at the Southeast Expressway. And so the options presented in the report here are either to raise the road or to provide a different type of flood protection here.
Excuse me, Zoe, is there any chance that you can make your graphic a little bit bigger, maybe to make it full screen?
Yeah, let me try to toggle that real quick. Is that a little better for you all?
It seems to be cut off on the left side a little bit.
Better?
That's better, yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So what this image is showing essentially is what this connection between Victory and Tinian could potentially look like. It shows the potential bike path and pedestrian way, the waterfront boardwalk. And so this is just to sort of visualize what increasing that open space could look like. So for the Port Norfolk area, in the near term, looking at some strategic road raising on the perimeter streets there near Lawley and Walnut, because Port Norfolk only has 2 means of egress and ingress there. And so keeping those roads open during a flood event is really key. Another solution here that's proposed is raising Joe Finnegan Park and including some living shoreline elements as well. And then building level adaptation, especially for the vulnerable buildings here, is really critical. And essentially what that is flood proofing by raising a home, elevating mechanicals, and things like that. And then in the long term here, there are actually 2 options. The first is to really lean into that building level adaptation and the more layered approaches across the whole area of Port Norfolk. Or the alternative is to focus in on a more perimeter protection approach that will include a combination of berms, flood walls, and would really depend on the coordination with the private owners there, as well as the new developments along the perimeter. And so here, moving into the Neponset Circle and Adams Village area, what's proposed is a tide gate right next to Pope John Paul II Park, as well as some open space enhancements that include berms, as well as extending some wetland resource areas here. And essentially what this is showing is opportunities to sort of build in a berm and more nature-based and wetland solutions. So this is what could potentially be. The alternative here is to sort of shore up that shoreline with using the existing harbor walk there. And so finally, we get to the Neponset River waterfront. So open space improvements here at the park and reservation include a combination of monitoring, developing a monitoring system, but for the buildings around that area, suggesting a combination of building level adaptation, an adapted rail and roadway where the Red Line Butler Station is, and the Mattapan trolley. And just to go back to the monitoring piece, the report suggests a monitoring and preservation program to more closely surveil the critical environmental assets that are there. And so the result of the program is essentially subsequent research that would allow us to develop adaptation strategies for the long term and to specifically protect the wetland itself. So this is an element of the report that I find really interesting. What we see here is modeling of the resilience interventions. And for this report, we were able to model all of the resilience interventions across the 5 zones. But I primarily wanted to show you the modeling for the Neponset wetland area to emphasize, one, the importance of the wetland and nature-based solutions as a resilience measure, but then also to really emphasize the need to identify solutions that will keep the wetland functioning and a thriving habitat. So what you're all looking at here is one, the extent of the flooding without any actions being taken is in the light purple. And then in the blue, we're showing the flooding that would still occur, that fringe flooding that would still occur with the interventions in place. And so the difference between those two is the amount of flooding that has been mitigated by the solutions. And then in the more darker blue is the interventions for the Red Line rail. And then in the striped blue, what we see are the suggestions for the open space and natural resource monitoring. And ultimately, the results from the flood modeling show that the natural resource and adaptation measures along the Neponset River area can reduce the impact of flooding both in the near term and the long term, which is a really huge win for nature-based solutions.
Great. And Zoe, I just want to remind you, we've got about 5 minutes left. So
awesome. Thank you. Just wrapping up. So again, you know, what this also indicates is that maintaining the wetland elevation relative to the sea level rise would essentially postpone the need for major flood protection or mitigation measures at especially the Butler Station area, as well as the adjacent streets. So the natural restoration and adaptation measures at this location would provide us a bit more time to monitor and get a better read on the sea level rise trends and plan accordingly. So just to really wrap up here, what's next? You know, slightly pivoting here, even as we look towards the path to implementation for the coastal resilience solutions, we recognize there's a significant need to address extreme heat and make sure that the plans that we're developing have a holistic approach to integrating resilience to other climate hazards. And so this winter, starting now, the city is in the process of actually launching a citywide heat resilience study that will identify a suite of urban heat reduction and heat resilience strategies. And so we're focusing engagement and solution development in and with environmental justice communities across 5 neighborhoods, really with the understanding that there are disproportionate effects of heat on some of these communities and folks who are more vulnerable to heat. And we're also recognizing the history of disinvestment in these communities as well. So Dorchester is one of these neighborhoods that we're focusing on. So I know that was a brief overview of that, but I would be happy to take more questions about that, or Climate Ready Dorchester specifically. And if we run out of time, please feel free to shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to connect with you all via email as well.
Great, thank you, Zoe. So everybody should make a note of Zoe's email there, so you can catch up with her later on. Two quick questions, since we don't have a lot of time, Zoe. If folks are interested in sort of keeping abreast of this and opportunities for future participation, is there a mailing list or something they should be looking to participate in, and where would they find that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have our Greenovate email list, and essentially that includes everything for especially Climate Ready, but the Environment Department as a whole. So if you go on the city's website, specifically the Preparing for Climate Change website, that's sort of where Climate Ready holds all of its information. You'll be able to find our Greenovate email list. And I can also forward that to you as well, Ian.
Great.
Yeah.
And then my other question was, this is obviously a pretty short presentation, and there's a lot of detail in this report to unpack for folks who are really interested in it. And presumably, can folks simply search Climate Ready Dorchester and they'll come across the full report pretty quickly?
Yeah, exactly. So you'll be able to find both the website as well as the report online.
Excellent. And we do have one question that I'll try to slip in the last minute here, which is, to what degree does subsidence contribute to sea level rise? And what, if anything, do we need to be thinking about doing about subsidence?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it is something that we have built into our calculations for understanding the flood elevation as well as the design flood elevation. So we're accounting for about 4 inches of subsidence. So when we say, for example, in 2070, when we're looking at 40 inches of sea level rise, it's actually 36 that we're looking at. And we're just adding in automatically that 4 inches of subsidence.
Right. Let me see if we can sneak in one more question.
Of course,
which
yeah.
is, has any consideration been given to strategic retreat from areas that are going to be inundated, as opposed to trying to raise infrastructure to keep the water out? And in an area that's so densely developed like this, how could you even consider implementing things like this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it is something that we talked quite a bit about for the Dorchester process specifically. We, at some point, it just gets too much to, continue to rebuild and to rebuild and to rebuild. And you want to be thinking about the investments that you're making and the input that you're getting out of it. But also we want to recognize that these are people's homes and these are people's businesses. So our intention here is to work with folks to understand what the best investment is and what the best course of action is. Part of that is a program that has been a part of Climate Ready, but it's something that we're trying to really build out, especially over the next few months as a pilot. We're trying to develop a sort of resilience assessment program so that we can work with homeowners, business owners, just people who are stakeholders in land and property, to understand what the best course of action is for them to be more resilient. So this will pair with some of the BPDA's resilient zoning, but this is, to really move into that next step with helping people identify funding, helping people identify the solutions that will work best for them, and helping people identify their risk on their property specifically.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Zoe. I know you have to get to another meeting, and I'm sure other people have to get back to work. So thank you for for being with us. I just want to take one moment to thank E&E Systems of Canton, who is our sponsor today, helping to underwrite the costs of the Watershed Wednesday series, and also to let folks know that our next event in this series is coming up on, I can even show you a slide of it, on March 10th, which is going to be a briefing with the Massachusetts Rivers Alliance on what is happening at the State House and key priorities around rivers at the State House these days. And lastly, just to let people know, we will have a recording of this session posted within about 24 hours or so, and we definitely encourage you to pass it along to people. You know, the city has really done an impressive job of trying to get people engaged in a really challenging and complicated set of issues. And I think for their benefit and our benefit, the more we can get the word out and encourage people to be engaged with these issues, the better off we will all be. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.